Today we're going to be focusing in on one towards the back end that he describes right there, gentleness. And I think it's really important that you and I set a definition for what gentleness is, because the way that Paul wrote about it thousands of years ago and the way that Jesus lived it is not the way that we interpret gentleness in 2020. Often when we hear that word, we get a little tense because we think of it as being weak, we think of it as being passive, and it doesn't really correlate. But that's not the way that Scripture and biblical gentleness is laid out for us. And so, since it's almost time to head back to school, I thought it would be great if you and I headed over to the whiteboard and we set out a definition of gentleness that we're going to be using for the rest of our time together, and hopefully that you will be able to use for the rest of your walk, because gentleness is handling people with care. See, gentleness is not just being weak. Gentleness is not just being passive and allowing life to pass us by as we kind of stand off to the sideline. That's not the way that Jesus did ministry. That's not the way that Jesus lived his life. But gentleness is handling people with care, and it's strength under control. So John 8, we're going to begin in verse 1. It says this: Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat and he taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" Their entire goal was to try to catch Jesus in a moment where he has to have a conflicting view with what the law had laid out, what Moses had said. And so that was their goal for putting him in this scenario as they interrupt his teaching. But Jesus says this in verse 6. They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against them, but Jesus stooped down and he wrote in the dust with his finger. We're going to go back to that in just a moment. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and he wrote in the dust. Now, Scripture doesn't exactly clarify what Jesus was writing in the dust that day. Many scholars believe that Jesus was beginning to write into the dust the sins of the Pharisees and the religious leaders that had gathered during that time, the ones that were there to stone that woman. They believed that Jesus was writing in the dust their own shortfalls and their own sins. We don't know exactly what happened, but it was enough to cause this reaction that we see in verse 9. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman, because Jesus knew no sin. Therefore, he was the last one standing there. Verse 10 says, "Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, 'Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?' 'No, Lord,' she said. And Jesus said to her, 'Neither do I. Go and sin no more.'" The first lesson that we can begin to take away is that I always keep my own weaknesses in full view. I always keep my own weaknesses in full view. If you like to take notes off to the side, whether it's on an iPad or a piece of paper, whatever it may be, underneath point number 1, would you just write the word humility? Because if we have humility, we're going to be able to keep our own weaknesses in full view. But humility was exactly what the Pharisees and the religious leaders at this time were lacking in this moment. Let's go back and check out verse 7 that we just read. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down and wrote again in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. See, the Pharisees of the time had completely lost sight of their own shortfalls. Their sin that they had committed at some point was no longer registering in this moment. They were just ready to take care of the sin of this woman that was caught in the act of adultery. When we begin to lose sight of our own sin, when we begin to elevate ourselves, and when we begin to compare the way that we live to the life of somebody else, is often when we find ourselves getting ready for a dark place and getting ready for trouble. Here's the second lesson that we can take away together out of John 8. Extend to others the same grace that Jesus has shown me. In verse 10, it says this, "Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, 'Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?' 'No, Lord,' she said. And Jesus said, 'Neither do I.'" I think there's moments where we really scratch the surface on what grace actually is. And you could spend an entire series in diving into God's grace and how it applies to our lives and how desperately we need it. But we've just got to sometimes take the step back and let the fact sink in that you and I are all sinners that have been saved by grace if we have a relationship with Christ. And when we begin to think about that emotion of being saved by grace, there's some emotions that can stir within us of hope and joy and a promise. Those are exciting and positive emotions. We've got to speak the truth in love. We've got to speak the truth in love. John 8:11, as Jesus is concluding this pretty incredible moment out of Scripture, he says this, "Go and sin no more." You see, he doesn't just have this interaction with the Pharisees where he tells them, if there's no sin in your life, you can be the first one to cast a stone, and they walk away, and then Jesus just goes off. He leaves the woman who was in the center of this story with a pretty strong commandment to go and to sin no more. Jesus wasn't undermining her sin. Jesus wasn't just brushing her sin off to the side of the story. He spoke the truth, but he did it in a loving way.